This whole story, it kicks off in just about the weirdest way you can imagine, with a single, totally unexpected text message to a journalist on her day off. What happened next was a wild 33-hour text exchange that pulled back the curtain on the very strange behavior of a very high-profile federal prosecutor. So imagine you get this on a Saturday afternoon. It's from a number you don't know on Signal, the encrypted app. The person says they're Lindsey Halligan, the prosecutor who's running this huge case against the New York Attorney General, Tish James. And right off the bat, the messages are set to disappear in 8 hours. I mean, it's cryptic, it's suspicious, and for reporter Anna Bauer, it was the start of a very, very weird weekend. And that is the central mystery we're unpacking here. This wasn't just, unusual. This was something that could potentially blow through a whole bunch of legal and ethical rules. So what on earth was going on?
Okay, so before we can even get into what was in the text, Anna Bauer had to do one critical thing first. Figure out if the person on the other end of the line was actually for real.
So how do you even do that? How do you verify an anonymous source who's claiming to be someone this powerful? Well, Bauer had this really clever test. She'd actually met Halligan once, years ago, at a hotel called The Breakers. She was with another attorney, James Trustee. It was a meeting she had never, ever written about. So she asked the texter, "Where did we meet, and who were you with?" And boom, a minute later, the response comes back, Breakers, Trustee. And just like that, everything changed. As wild as it seemed, she was, in fact, texting with the real Lindsey Halligan.
All right, so now we know for sure who's texting. The next big question is, why was she texting? And it all comes down to the case she was prosecuting against Tish James, a case that was already raising a lot of eyebrows.
So the indictment accused Tish James of mortgage fraud. And here's the claim, that she bought a property, told the bank it was a second home to snag a better loan rate, but then secretly used it as a rental property to collect thousands of dollars. The entire case really hung on this one question. Was this property actually a rental investment? But here's the thing. Even before these mysterious texts started flying around, journalists like Anna Bauer were already raising some serious red flags about this indictment. The allegations just seemed kind of thin, especially when you looked at the public documents.
And when you put the two side by side, the discrepancies were pretty glaring. I mean, the indictment paints this picture of a secret rental scheme, but the actual mortgage agreement, it used standard language that allowed for occasional rentals. And while the indictment vaguely talks about thousands of dollars in rent, James's own public financial disclosures showed she only reported a small amount of rental income one time, 5 years ago. It just didn't really seem to add up to a huge criminal fraud case.
And all of that skepticism, that's what brings us right back to that Saturday afternoon, because this whole 33-hour text saga was kicked off by one single tweet Anna Bauer posted, where she just summarized what another news outlet was reporting on the case.
See, Bauer had read a New York Times story that seemed to poke this giant hole in the prosecution's whole argument. The Times was reporting that the person living in the house was actually James's own grandniece, and that she had testified to a grand jury that she'd lived there for years without paying any rent. Well, if your supposed tenant isn't paying rent, that completely undermines the whole idea that it's a rental investment property, right? Bauer just summarized this fact on Twitter, and apparently that's what set Halligan off.
The conversation that followed was just baffling. Over and over, Bauer asked Halligan to just point out one specific thing that was wrong either in her tweet or in the New York Times story. But Halligan would just give these vague accusations, claim the reporting was way off, and then completely deflect. It was this frustrating circular conversation that went absolutely nowhere.
And then, after a day and a half of this back and forth, poof, she just stopped responding. Bauer sent more questions, but got nothing. The United States attorney who started this whole unsolicited, strange conversation was now just ghosting the reporter.
Now, this bizarre exchange wasn't just unprofessional. It raised some really serious questions about whether a top federal prosecutor had broken several fundamental legal and ethical rules. So the most significant one is a rule known as 6E, grand jury secrecy. And this is a huge deal. It is a cornerstone of the federal justice system. It's there to protect the integrity of investigations by making sure prosecutors don't leak what happens inside the secret proceedings of a grand jury.
And here's the crucial part, the thing you really have to get. Halligan, as the government attorney, is strictly bound by this secrecy rule. But witnesses, defense lawyers, and especially the press, they are not.
So when Halligan was criticizing the New York Times for reporting on grand jury testimony, she was scolding them for doing something they are totally legally allowed to do, while potentially breaking the very rule that she herself was sworn to uphold.
And it didn't even stop there. The Department of Justice has these super strict policies that limit what prosecutors can say publicly about their cases. And using a disappearing message app for what could easily be considered official business, that's a potential violation of the Federal Records Act. And the ultimate irony here? Halligan's own office had just fired 2 prosecutors for supposedly leaking information, and they had this stated zero-tolerance policy on leaks. So, Anna Bauer and her editors, they decided this whole exchange, this was a story in itself. They got an article ready detailing all the texts, but just minutes before their deadline, the story took one last really dramatic turn. So, after days of completely ghosting Bauer, Halligan's Signal chat suddenly came back to life. Just 5 minutes before the story was scheduled to be published, a brand new message popped up.
And this was it. This was her last-ditch effort. A retroactive attempt to just declare their entire conversation confidential, complete with this little jab that Bauer isn't a real journalist. But, as any reporter will tell you, that's just not how any of this works.
In journalism, off the record is a formal agreement. It's a negotiation. The source has to ask, and the journalist has to agree before the conversation happens. You can't just talk to someone for 33 hours and then, after the fact, decide none of it can be reported. It just doesn't work that way. And Halligan, who actually has a degree in broadcast journalism, absolutely should have known that.
And with that, the story was published, including all the text messages, and the real-world consequences for Prosecutor Halligan, well, they began almost immediately.
Tish James's defense team immediately filed a motion in court asking for action against Halligan. They laid out this whole laundry list of potential violations, connecting all the dots we've just talked about. The potential breach of grand jury secrecy, violating DOJ regulations, breaking the Federal Records Act, and just ignoring the basic rules of professional conduct for lawyers.
And this really gets to the heart of why this all matters so much. The defense argued that these rules aren't just little technicalities. They are, and I'm quoting here, clear, bright-line prohibitions that exist for one specific reason: to stop people in positions of immense power, like a federal prosecutor, from abusing that power.
And really, that's the question this whole bizarre saga leaves us with. This wasn't just some weird text exchange. It was a rare public peek into the behavior of a powerful official who seemed to disregard the very rules she was supposed to be enforcing. And it raises these profound questions about accountability, about ethics, and about the integrity of the justice system itself.